Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing very well, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to sharing this story with you this evening. I do hope you're keeping lovely and cosy, enjoying the fresh air, drinking lots of lovely warm drinks, and whatever you're drinking, let me know about it, because I love hearing from you. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and a thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I had taken the long, exhausting, debilitating international flight from London, England, back to my small, rather obscure hometown in America, a mere dot on the map, a huge place in my heart. I was cramped tightly in the aircraft, pinned behind a large man who occupied the seat in front of me. He'd unfortunately pushed his seat right back to maximise his own personal comfort and space, so that I was now unduly confined, so much so that I could barely move. It didn't help that the woman next to me was very sizable, so I felt that I was squeezed in at both sides, rather like a frankfurter between two halves of a white roll. Thankfully I was in the aisle seat, which invariably meant I could get up during the night to stretch my legs, my one saving grace, and thank goodness for that. Needless to say, the woman next to me, as sweet as she may have been, talked the entire trip non-stop, like a radio on full blast that wouldn't stop jabbing away. So half the time I pretended to be asleep. How I wished I could afford a seat in first class. These long drawn-out flights sucked the very life out of me. I decided on a whim to return home to surprise my mother, as my 2-year fine arts course had finished earlier than I'd imagined. I was longing to get back home to America. Don't get me wrong, I thoroughly enjoyed living in London. It was a good experience, a whole different way of life. I found London to be a happening, exciting, bustling, cosmopolitan city that was vibrant and alive, buzzing with red London buses, black taxi cabs, a plethora of exciting rip-roaring shopping opportunities, excellent restaurants, coffee shops, delicious sandwich bars, flourishing charismatic streets filled with hastening people rushing to take the next connection on the underground. But in truth, there was nothing that galvanized me more than the provocative, nostalgic feelings I possessed for my own little alluring hometown. Of course, without wishing to sound biased, I adored America. The land of the big, the land of the mighty, the brave, the victorious, the great. I had a voracious, burning desire to get home, as if every part of my body ached, to return to my old familiar bedroom, painted in a blush rose, with its large upstairs windows that overlooked fabulously spectacular views over the backyard, and a couple of majestic walnut trees that were as large as they were wide. All my life I had regarded them as personal friends. I loved those trees. I had visions of my undisturbed bedroom, which my mother had always assured me remained exactly the way that I had left it, with bookshelves bulging at the seams with fictional novels, and my gorgeous ornate four-poster bed, of where I had enjoyed many a refreshing good night's sleep, tucked under my pink duvet covers, cushioning my head against the soft blush-pink puffy goose-down pillows, waking up to be greeted by the inviting, aromatic, rich smell of fresh coffee percolating in the kitchen, being able to walk around our backyard, gazing at the distant spectacular views of the towering mountains that stood up regally, proud and tall, under a shimmering blue sky, like voluptuous Rubenesque women, their curvaceous curves soaking up the glorious sunshine. I looked forward to renewing my regular rambles down some of those glorious woodland trails by climbing over the fence into the area of rich evergreen national forest that framed the rear of the residential properties on our side of the street. For all intensive purposes, the fence was no obstacle course for the deer that were often seen scampering around our backyard in the late evening or early morning. I even caught sight of the occasional black bear loitering around our yard, gathering walnuts in season from our trees, or making a complete mess of the bird table, where my mother sprinkled the seeds for the tiny little birds. More often or not, the bears broke the bird table into hundreds of pieces. I knew that my mother would be over the moon to see me again, 2 years was a considerably long time to be away from home. My mother had been a divorcee for over 20 years. She had raised me as a hard-working single woman, taking on a job as a doctor's receptionist to provide for my every need. I certainly hadn't wanted for a thing. It had not always been easy for us, but it had been the two of us against the world. We had grown very close over the years. My biological father lived in Toronto. He was currently married to a French Canadian, so I had 2 half-brothers fluent in French that I occasionally saw from time to time, and we were very close. I smiled to myself happily as I began to visualize my mother's surprised reaction when I bounded up to the front door, ringing the doorbell. I could see her animated face when she opened the door to see me standing there, larger than life. She would be in 7th heaven to have her daughter back home again. I was champing at the bit to get home. I was furiously frustrated by all the inevitable hold-ups at the airport when I made my way through customs. Fortunately, I was able to hire a green car that looked more like Hermit the Frog, but finally I was on my way to see my mother, hitting the gas pedal a little too enthusiastically in my haste to get home. Soon my brilliant slimy green car was gliding down a familiar part of the interstate. Then I began to take all the necessary turn-offs, meandering down some of those crooked country roads, listening to my favourite music on radio, until finally I took the left turning that I knew so very well, down the long ribbon of asphalt, the quintessential street I'd grown up on as a young girl. Wistful memories came flooding back of the times I rode a bicycle down this road with my best friend Lily Madison and her brother Luke. My car began to slow down. I drew in long deep breaths, as if I was about to dive under the water in a swimming pool to conserve oxygen. I surveyed the evocative street through my dewy eyes, with its long rows of sentimental vintage retrograde-looking semi-detached houses on either side that had been built in the 50s, oozing old-world character and classic traditional charm, although many of them had been refurbished of late in more recent years. The street seemed so quiet and peaceful as the first gleaming light of the new morning twinkled through the cobalt-blue sky. Its ethereal shafts seemed to splash across the houses, casting dramatic artistic shadows against the walls of the property, while the front yards that fringed the common land of the homes was comprised of pristinely manicured verdant front lawns that were now bespeckled with a thin silvery sheen of morning dew. The tall statuesque oak trees had definitely grown considerably in the 2 years I'd been away. They gracefully framed either side of the street, had gained girth and height, were so much more imposing and masterful than ever before. It seemed surreal, nostalgic, magical, being back in my hometown again. I had to pinch myself. Was I really here, I wondered? It was as if time had stood still, as not much had really changed in 2 years, although many of the houses had gained a recent touch of paint and looked as if their formerly tired exteriors had been rejuvenated with a facelift that made the old residential heritage houses look all the more refreshed, my mother's house being no exception to that rule. I was rather surprised she had painted it a grey-blue colour, as it had formerly always been white, but the change was aesthetically pleasing on the eye, most certainly complementing the sky favourably. My green car seemed very pronounced on the street corner, sticking out like a sore thumb. But then Hermit the Frog was never a very retiring or submissive character, was he? Ostensibly neither was his car. It clearly wanted to draw attention to itself, but not in a good way like a Lotus or a Lamborghini would. I knew in my small town people would be talking soon, as words spread faster than the internet around here. The locals would be very eager to know who was driving the Hermit the Frog look-alike car. Before long everyone would ascertain that I was back home. The likes of Peggy Parker Lane, who was the local town busybody, with a tongue on her so long she could catch flies. She was so garrulous, a gossip who put her nose into everybody's business. I could already visualize her telling everybody that Marjorie was now back in town. My heart began to do excited flip-flops as I made my way to the front door, swiftly dashing up the familiar terracotta steps, an act that I'd done so many spontaneous times, hundreds of times before. I noticed my mother had a fabulous, cheerful hanging basket on display at the front door, brimming over with bright purple and pink geraniums. It was early on a Saturday morning, so I wasn't sure she was up, although I thought I heard murmuring voices in the background, and my mother's pretty musical laugh, so then she must be up and about. That was good news. I eagerly rang the doorbell, then turned around so that my back was facing away from the door, so that ultimately my mother would fail to realise it was me for a moment. Then I would turn around and shock her. I could hear my mother answering the door as she fiddled with the lock. "Hello, can I help you?" I turned around with a broad, beaming grin on my face. "Mum, it's me!" My mother looked dumbfounded, her mouth hung open, her cornflower blue eyes growing as wide as saucers. "Oh, my darling, it's really you!" she said, dashing towards me, throwing her arms around me in a huge, generous, effusive hug, her eyes brimming with tears. "Let's have a look at you, sweetheart," she said, standing back. "My, you've grown up in 2 years. You look so sophisticated. It must be the influences of living in a cosmopolitan city like London. You look great. You're positively glowing." "Who is this?" came the raspy voice of an intrusive, discourteous man who was standing in the doorway, wearing a bright red pair of boxer shorts, with his hairless, bronzed, flat chest on full display. He was eating a piece of buttered toast in a nonchalant way. My mother flushed bright pink with embarrassment to have been caught in a compromising situation like this, for growing up as a young girl, she had never dated other men, or even brought a stranger ever home like this. So this was a turn-up for the books, something I wasn't expecting to see. It was my turn to be shocked. My mouth dropped to the ground in a wide, inappropriate gawk, as I looked at the familiar man in horror. He was impertinently walking around my mother's house, half naked, looking exceedingly comfortable in his own skin. Far too comfortable for my liking, so much so that he made my skin physically crawl, as if something really cold-blooded and repugnant was slithering down my spine like a poisonous snake. Of course I recognised him at once. How could I not? For his distinguishable face I was unlikely to ever forget, as it had left an indelible mark and impression on my memory, as growing up this obnoxious man had literally haunted my daily life, with his haughty demeanour and foul mouth that only breathed out dragon smoke and vile four-letter innuendos that would leave behind an awful, frightful stench if I were to repeat those words on paper, which certainly wouldn't be good. But I can leave them to your imagination. My heart sank like a brick being flung into a vast body of water, sinking to the very bottom. I could feel the nausea flooding the back of my throat. I could taste the bitter bile on my tongue. Mr. Arthur Fleming had been our next-door neighbour for as long as I could remember. The disagreeable, cantankerous, crabby town creep had always despised young children, made no secret of the displeasure they provoked in him. So memories flashed through my mind of all the times this man had thrown a wobbly with me and my friends. Now this abysmal specimen of a human being was seeking out sanctuary under our grey slate roof, refuge and love in the loving arms of my mother. Worse still, he was walking around our family home like a stuffed penguin with a puffed-up chest, inflated ego, as if he owned the place. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Every single cell in my body was on fire. Of all the men in the entire world my mother could have hooked up with, why did it have to be him? It could have been anybody else, and I would have been accepting of it. But not him. Please, no. As a young kid, I had despised the man, and that was the understatement of the century. And I am not given to disliking people easily. "And who do we have here?" asked Arthur, clearly unable to recognise me at all. Surely I hadn't changed that much. I'd only been away for 2 years, for goodness sake, not an entire century. Granted, my hairstyle was rather trendy. There were blonde and reddish highlights in my chestnut hair. I might have also lost a couple of kilos, possibly more, from all that walking around London which made me terribly fit. But other than that, I was not all that dissimilar to the girl who'd left town 2 years earlier. "This is my daughter, Arthur. Don't you remember Marjorie, when she was a little girl? Those long brown pigtails, that cute little smile with dimples, the scattering of freckles on her nose." Arthur stopped eating his toast. He stared at me in astonishment. "By Jove! I wouldn't have recognised you at all. You've grown into a fine young lady." "Hasn't she just?" said my mother. "She looks so glamorous, doesn't she?" "Indeed," said Arthur, "quite a transformation. She was very mousy before when she was young. Who would have thought she'd turn into a firecracker? I'd never have considered it possible. Quite a metamorphosis from a caterpillar into a butterfly." I ignored his blunt remarks. "Mum, what's going on here?" I asked, nodding my head in Arthur's direction, not really caring how rude I appeared. I distinctly disliked this man. I certainly didn't appreciate him in my home, or having referred to my former appearance as mousy. What a bloody cheek! He was hardly the face of America himself, but the way he was swooning around, he certainly thought he was. That ego on him was insatiable. My mother flushed bright pink again. Her eyes hovered uneasily from me to Arthur. She looked as if she was desperately trying to find the words to explain what this unwelcome man was doing in our home. She seemed guarded, restrained, unforthcoming in her answers. "Isn't it obvious?" said Arthur obtrusively. "Or do I have to spell it out to you in black and white, Marjorie? Me and your mother are together. We're in a relationship," he said, putting a protective arm around my mother to affirm his intimacy with her, like a belligerent dog that was guarding his turf, telling you in no uncertain terms to keep away, she's mine. I could see a smug, victorious look rising up in his eyes, like an all-consuming, conquering high breaker out at sea, determined to shatter and destroy everything in its wake, like a tsunami. I was so astonished. I certainly did not know how to react. I mean, what on earth did I say in a thorny situation like this, when what I was seeing and hearing were horrifying in every regard? Much like the acorns from an oak tree, almost impossible to digest or assimilate. My mother gestured for me to come in. "Where your bags, sweetheart?" she asked me. "They're in the Hermit the Frog car out there that I hired." "Would you be a dear, Arthur?" she said. "Bring in Marjorie's bags from the trunk for me, won't you? Take them up to her bedroom. I'd be ever so grateful." "Of course. You must mind my manners, Marjorie. I'll go and put on a shirt," he said, "to make myself halfway decent. I can't go around the street without my shirt off, as people will talk," he said. "Give me your keys." I opened my handbag, tossing him my keys. He grabbed them from me and gave me a wink. "Look at you, my poor darling girl," said my mother, cupping her hand under my chin affectionately. "You must be exhausted, frazzled from your flight, darling. Those long-haul flights are nothing to be sneezed at. Come on into the kitchen. Let's make you a cup of tea or coffee, shall we? You certainly need a caffeine boost, I'm sure." When Arthur was out of sight, I unabashedly laid into my mother. "Mum, what are you doing with him? He's not a good man. When I was a little girl, he was positively nasty to us, vindictive, downright mean. You don't want to be dating someone like him. You could do so much better for yourself. Don't sell yourself short. You're a beautiful woman, Mum. You could have your pick of men." "Sweetheart, we're together," said my mother bashfully. "When you went away to London, it got awfully lonely around here. I missed you so desperately. I felt so isolated. Arthur would check up on me regularly to see if I was all right. He'd come around to fix things for me, replace light bulbs that blew, help me get the refrigerator and washing machine sorted out. He even mowed my lawn for me." "So he rarely ingratiated himself towards you, did he?" I said with a laser-sharp edge to my voice that could have cut glass. "I bet he did." "It wasn't like that, sweetheart. Underneath it all, Arthur is a charming man." My mother was distracting herself as she was talking, desperately trying to avoid eye contact with me, as she put the kettle on the gas hob. I think my mother was not appreciating my ungainly, butter-fingered interrogation. But as her daughter, I had a right to express my thoughts on the matter. I was not about to hold back on my misgivings, dividends or reservations over Arthur Fleming. "No one in town ever liked him, Mum. And you get involved with him? I mean, how could you? Surely you know what he's really like." "That's a bit unkind, sweetheart. Don't you think you're being unnecessarily hard on him? Don't you want me to be happy?" "Of course I want you to be happy, Mum. But with him, no. He's not right for you. He hasn't got a good heart. You let me decide that, darling, will you? I know him a lot better than you do. He may appear outwardly grouchy and peevish to people who don't know him, but he's actually a sweetheart. Do you remember that time we went missing, the three of us kids, and you didn't know where we were?" My mother nodded. "Yes, I remember that very well. How could I ever forget a night like that? When I thought you'd been abducted, my whole world came crumbling down. It was the worst night of my life. I didn't think I'd ever be able to go on if I'd lost you. Everyone in town was searching for you and the Madison kids, but you were nowhere to be found. It was like you'd vanished off the face of the earth, like those god-awful 411 mystery cases. Why? What has Arthur got to do with any of that? I don't understand. You turned up all fine, claiming you got lost in the woodgrove." "Unfortunately, Mum, I regret to have to tell you this, but that was a lie. It was Arthur who locked us up in his yard shed. He left us there all night. He knew exactly what he was doing. Worse still, he got a great deal of pleasure out of terrifying us out of our wits. And poor little Lily. Oh, she was so petrified of the dark. We had to really console her. She was crying all the time. She was really frantic." My mother's face grew white. The colour drained from her skin. "You never told me any of this." "We didn't want to tell anyone, Mum. We were scared stiff of Arthur, what he was capable of. We swore blind to each other we would never tell anyone what he'd done, in case he became vengeful towards us. He did warn us when we saw him the following day, that if we told anyone that he'd locked us up in the shed, that he'd kill our cat. You remember old Purdy?" My mother nodded. "I remember Purdy. Beautiful cat. Well, he told us he'd kill her." Oh, I can't believe it. It had happened over 18 years ago, when I was a young girl of about 10 years old. I could remember the day as if it was yesterday. It had been a Friday, on our summer holiday. Me and my two friends, Lily and Luke Madison, were riding our bikes down the long ribbon of asphalt that ran down our street like a smooth grey tributary. I remember that Arthur sped up as he came down the road in his truck, narrowly missing throwing Luke off his bike. We knew he had deliberately sped up when he saw us on the road. He wanted to scare the life out of us by pretending he was going to knock us over on our bicycles. He very nearly did. He revved up his engine deliberately and went literally directly towards us in his car. I could see the smug look of satisfaction on his face. He was actually laughing at our expense, as if highly amused to see us so discomposed. I do know he was angry with the Madison kid, as Luke, whose house was directly opposite his, had accidentally thrown a ball through his window when he'd been kicking around a ball in the backyard, and like a bullet it had ricocheted, shattering the glass pane of his living room. Arthur had marched over to the Madison house in an incandescent rage, his whole body jiggering in indignation, his eyes like deep swirling pools of hatred. According to Luke, he had stood at the front door, virtually growling at his mother, complaining that Luke had deliberately thrown a ball through his window. "You need to watch that son of yours, Mrs. Madison. He's growing up into an insubordinate, insolent boy." "I'm sorry, but I take objection to that, Mr. Fleming. I've raised my kids good and proper. Luke would never intentionally break your window. He's a courteous little boy."
"Is that what you think, Mrs. Madison? It seems that you are very conveniently, obstinately naive about your impudent, audacious children and their behaviour."
"Would you please leave, Mr. Fleming? We'll send someone over to fix your window in the morning. Now go." Arthur hadn't appreciated Mrs. Madison's unambiguous, forthright manner. He'd stormed off in a seething rage, his nose virtually flaring as it puffed out smoke rather like a dragon. He didn't like the female sex standing up to him so defiantly. It demasculated him, made him feel small, obscure, inconspicuous. So from that moment on, Mrs. Madison's letterbox was flooded with unmentionable deliveries of dead rats, pig snouts, and dog turd. There was no doubt who the packages were from, but Mrs. Madison chose to do the wisest thing ever. She never once reacted to any of those packages, until Mr. Fleming grew tired and bored of posting the unmentionables and stopped. He had hoped to get a rise out of Mrs. Madison, bringing on some neighbourly dispute, as Mr. Fleming loved nothing better than to instigate a fight. But Mrs. Madison was not biting the bait. She was true to her word, and had sent someone over to replace the broken window the following day. By all accounts, Arthur was insistent that Luke had thrown the ball deliberately into his living room, shattering the window, which of course was not true. Over the years there was no love lost between Mr. Fleming and most of the townsfolk. He was always getting caught up in verbal altercations with people over the most nonsensical things, especially when he engaged in one too many drinks at the local bar. Then his tongue would loosen. He would get carried away in his inebriation, telling people what he really thought of them, spouting out of his mouth lewd obscenities, provoking many a drunken brawl, where he was often incarcerated overnight by the duty officer for vulgar, salacious and crude behaviour. It would seem he didn't have a high opinion of anyone, but then neither did the townsfolk reciprocate a high opinion of him. After that harrowing, uncalled-for incident with Mr. Fleming, pretending to run us over in his truck, a misleading, duplicitous act, which brought him a great deal of pleasure, me and my two friends conspired to get even with him. Later that afternoon, when Arthur had left his residence for his local Friday shop, we decided to root around in his backyard shed, when he wasn't around. Suffice to say, his yard shed was meticulous, without even a finger of dust anywhere. Everything was so well organised and ordered, with neat boxes all fastidiously labelled with screws, twine, hooks and so forth. Then there were shelves stacked high with all kinds of things, from weed killers to household paints, bug killers, paintbrushes, bags of stone, cement. And then there were the usual yard tools like rakes, trowels, forks, leaf blowers. We knew we wanted to do something that would upset Arthur significantly, to cause him some discomfort. We didn't want to do anything that would suspiciously be able to pin the blame back on us. It had to be very subtle, but irritating enough for us to feel that we had caused him a measure of inconvenience. We thought if we turned the yard shed upside down, scattering all the stuff around, we would make a nice mess for him to have to clean up. Given that he was so fastidious, a mess would be very irksome to him. Maybe we could throw stuff off the shelves, open a paint can, allow some paint to accidentally on purpose spill all over the wooden floor, swathing everything in globlets of paint that would hopefully be worse to remove than chewing gum. Mr. Fleming might think that a lone raccoon rooting around for birdseed had caused the damage, but I had the great idea of hiding a dead fish somewhere in the shed, so that when it went off and turned rancid, that Mr. Fleming would be faced with a vile, noxious smell that was so overpowering he'd pass out from its dreadful offence. Well, so we hoped, as I had heard of this happening to people before. My two friends thought my groundbreaking idea was absolutely brilliant. Not to put too fine a point on it, I did too. We had visions of Mr. Fleming smelling the rotting stink, fainting out of the sheer horror. I was able to extract a couple of trout from the freezer. My mother had clean forgotten about them. They would soon defrost and then go off. But the question was where to hide the fish in Arthur Fleming's immaculate, pristine shed. "I think we should hide it in one of Fleming's paint cans," said Lily. "No, bad idea," I'd said. The smell of the paint might mask the rancid smell of the putrid, decomposing fish. "Maybe we should put the fish in a bag of stones," Luke had suggested. We couldn't agree where to hide the fish. We were arguing about the best place to hide them, when suddenly we heard deliberate footsteps walking towards the shed. I knew they belonged to Mr. Fleming. He had returned from his trip a whole lot sooner than we had envisaged. We were about to get caught red-handed, ferreting around in his shed. It was worse than that. Oh my God, he'd seen us. I could see his face peering in at us through the yard shed window. There was a huge, satisfied smirk on his face. He then slammed the door shut on us, pulling the manual outside lock across the horizontal latch, so that we were well and truly locked in, with no way of escape. This was his revenge on us, and he was loving every minute of our incarceration. "Oh my God," I gasped. "Mr. Fleming has just locked us in his shed." He pulled the outside manual lock across. I know he saw us in here. He had a real satisfied smirk on his face. He did it intentionally. It wasn't a mistake. He wants to leave us here to stew like prunes in a brine of tea. We began to bang on the yard shed. "Mr. Fleming! Mr. Fleming! Mr. Fleming! Please let us out! Please take us out! We're locked up in your shed! Mr. Fleming! We're locked up in your shed!" We took a garden trowel and slammed it against the wooden panelling of the shed as hard as we could, making a huge commotion. But once again, the man deliberately ignored us and never came to our rescue. Believe me, we banged that shed for a very long time. We were naturally terrified being locked up in the yard shed, especially as the day folded away and darkness seeped across the valley, obliterating any remnants of the day. Worse still, there was no light connection in the yard shed, so we sat there in the gloomy darkness. It was a cold night. The three of us were shivering. We had given up shouting for help. It seemed no one had heard our frantic cries, and our voices became hoarse. I think for some reason the yard shed was made from a thick timber beams, situated in the furthest corner of Mr. Fleming's yard, in an isolated spot. For some reason it seemed to be soundproof. We were terribly afraid, as we had visions of becoming prisoners of Mr. Fleming's. Unbeknown to us, people in our small town were all out searching for us. Over 200 people were looking for us and scaling the woodgrove, calling out our names, but we heard and saw nothing. My mother and the Madisons were frantic, believing we'd been abducted, and all the while we were simply just trapped in Mr. Fleming's shed, and he knew all about it. He was a nasty, spiteful, vindictive piece of work. He knew exactly where we were, but he willfully, brazenly ignored us, abandoned us here. I do remember Lily was particularly terrified of the dark. She always slept with her nightlight on, so the tenebrous night with its cool breeze and whistling wind that was howling outside, banging against the wooden panels precariously, did little to comfort her.
I'm scared. I'm really scared. It's so cold in here. I'm really freezing and I'm frightened. It's so dark.
It's all right, Lily. Calm down, Luke assured her. We're here with you. Nothing bad can happen to you. We're going to be just fine, I promise you. We were all cuddled up together to keep warm. We told each other positive stories to keep ourselves entertained and upbeat. But we kept the scary stories out of the picture. That was when we heard what I can only describe as anomalous heavy footfall. Someone else was out there, walking around the yard. Whoever they were, they seemed to be thumping the ground, under weighty feet so very hard that even the paint cans on Mr. Fleming's shelves began to vibrate. It gave us the distinct impression that whoever or whatever was out there was quite substantial in size. We wanted to get their attention, so we began to bang away at the yard shed.
Help! Someone please help! We're locked up in here! We're locked up in the shed! Help us! Help us!
Please, let us out! We could hear the heavy feet moving towards us, stopping cautiously for a moment, then running decisively towards the shed. I was looking out of the shed window. The light of the full moon cast its shadows upon the creature. But what was it? I'd never seen a creature like this before. It looked human, but it wasn't. It possessed ape-like influences to its humanoid appearance. It was about 6 foot tall, 3 feet wide across the shoulders, and possibly between 400 to 500 pounds. Its whole body was covered with long flowing dark hair, but it looked so dramatically dense, so burly and solid, blacker than the night. His formidable silhouette seemed intimidating. The creature, whatever it was, locked eyes with me. His deep-set eyes gave off a glimmer of red eyeshine. His face appeared remarkably human, his skin leathery and very shiny, his nose flat and aquatic, his forehead deeply furrowed. I was stunned, so stunned that I couldn't react. What was this thing staring right at me?
"Let us out! Let us out!" came my friends' voices. "Let us out!"
They had not seen the creature and were still slamming the wooden panels of the shed to attract attention. I was the one that was looking out of the window. The creature moved away from the window. He began fumbling around with the outside lock. He pulled it back with his fingers, opening the yard shed for us wide. He was clearly an intelligent creature who could figure out things. That was when we saw him up close and personal, standing only feet away from us. He was so incredibly close to us that we could hear his breathing, that reminded us of a horse. To this day I don't know why none of us screamed, but I imagine my friends were feeling much the same as I was. For me personally, seeing the creature, that was beyond the realms of our understanding, looking so strikingly like a human covered in hair, has the innate capacity to hijack your terror, taking it hostage, as if holding it in suspended animation for a while, almost as if we'd been temporarily sucked out of our bodies, as if we were observing the scene unfolding before us in a detached, indifferent way, almost as if we were watching a movie. It felt so surreal, so outer-worldly, so incomprehensible, so outlandish, so nonsensical, so much so that I rarely believed I had to be dreaming, but I knew I wasn't. We all knew that whatever this thing was, it was definitely real. The critter studied us through its eyes. One thing we all remembered clearly from the event was that those eyes were incredibly kind. I remember Lily saying to me when we discussed the strange creature afterwards, "When I saw the eyes, I knew we were safe. I knew he'd come to help us. He had the most beautiful eyes that I've ever seen. They were so kind." We did ponder for years afterwards whether the creature who opened the door for us that we later learnt must have been a Bigfoot had heard us from a long way off and intentionally came to save us. We certainly hoped so. The creature looked at us for a moment, grunted, spoke some strange audible words to us that we couldn't understand. But Lily is convinced he said, "So you're all right now. I can go." At that the creature glided away, disappearing into the shadows. You would think now that we were free that we would dash home faster than greased lightning. But after our extraordinary encounter, we were looking at each other in wondrous awe. "What the heck was that?" we said to each other, for none of us had a clue what we'd seen. We decided to lock up the shed on the outside, so that Mr. Fleming would open the yard shed in the morning, to find we'd magically disappeared. We wished we could be flies on the wall to see his perturbed reaction. "Mustn't tell anyone where we've been," Luke insisted. "Let's tell the parents we got lost in the woodgrove. What happened tonight is our secret." We cemented our agreement with a scout's salute of honour, which could never ever be broken. We decided to hide the 2 defrosted trout under a loose floorboard in the shed. We didn't think Mr. Fleming would choose to look there. Needless to say, when we returned home, the relief our parents experienced was overwhelming. I remember my mother was in a dreadful frenzy, so when I came through the door, she held me in her arms, rocking me backwards and forwards, not wanting to let me go. She was sobbing with relief. As I gave my mother a brief overview of what had happened that night, I wanted her now more than ever to realize that the man she was hitched with was an insidious character, and not what he seemed to be. "Is this true?" my mother said, as Arthur came into the kitchen, exclaiming that all my suitcases were now safely in my old childhood bedroom. "Is what true?" asked Arthur. He looked at my mother, a agog expression on her face, his eyes darting from me to her in succession. "Is what true?" Arthur repeated. "Did you lock my daughter in the yard shed with her 2 friends, Luke and Lily, when they were only 10 years old? Is it true?" Arthur stood there, his jaws stiffened, his eyes grew anxious, his skin flushed a bright pink colour. "You did, didn't you? You locked them in the shed," said my mother, rushing over to Arthur, pushing him with her hands and hitting him. "You did, didn't you? Admit it! Admit it!" My mother's eyes were filling with tears. "How could you do such a despicable thing? The kids were only 10 years old, for goodness sake. I thought I'd lost my baby for good."
"I was teaching them a lesson. They were obnoxious children, always misbehaving and getting into trouble. For Luke, whenever he walked that dog of his, he deliberately encouraged him to defecate on the lawn. How do you think that made me feel? He also deliberately broke my window with his ball."
"I don't care a monkey's ass about that. You know, Arthur, that everyone in the town was looking for those kids that night when they went missing. Even the sheriff was called. Do you realise the manpower, the time that people gave up to look for the kids? People were selfless in their generosity to help. I was emotionally exhausted, drained. I'd never been so terrified in all my life. And all the time you'd lock the kids in the shed. And you know what's even more despicable? Is, if I remember correctly, you accompanied the townsfolk on their search. You helped them look for the children, when all the while you knew exactly where they were. That makes you seriously sick in the head. That sort of mentality belongs to a serial killer. Someone who has no compassion whatsoever.
"Look, Esther, you're overreacting. I told you I was teaching the kids a lesson."
"A lesson? Do you have any idea what I went through?
Get out, Arthur. Take all your things. Go now." "Don't be like that, Esther. You know we have a good thing going between us. Don't throw it all away."
"My daughter's made me see the truth about you, Arthur. Leave now. Go at once. I don't want to see you again." We watched Arthur grabbing his things. He looked at me with hostile, belligerent eyes.
I might have known that when you got back, little missy, that you'd cause trouble. You may look all glamorous and sophisticated now. You think yourself all high and mighty, as you've been to London for 2 years. But I'll tell you something for nothing. You are still the same little obnoxious brat you were when you were 10. It seems nothing changes.
And it would seem, Mr. Fleming, that you're the same nasty man who locked us up in the shed all those years ago. Arthur stopped short in his tracks with his suitcase in his hands.
I meant to ask, who let you out of my shed? Because it wasn't me.
Wouldn't you like to know, I said.
It's a secret. Arthur scowled. You know that shed? It stunk to high heaven for a month after you were locked in it. It was the vilest, most odorous smell I've ever smelt. I could never find its source.
That's because I took 2 trout and let them rot under your floorboards.
You hear that, Esther? You think I'm obnoxious? What about this kid of yours?
Sounds like you got what you deserve, Arthur. Now out with you. Once Arthur had left, me and my mother embraced in each other's arms, so happy to see each other again. I'm so sorry, darling. I should never have brought that ghastly man into our home. I don't know what I was thinking. I guess I was so horribly lonely. I think you make allowances when you're lonely, by refusing to see what is staring you blindly in the face. Even during the course of our relationship, I saw things in Arthur that were odious and unethical, but I kept making excuses for the man. Of course you did, Mum. It's perfectly understandable in the circumstances. Well, I'm not sure. It is. Everyone in town has been warning me to stay away from the man. But would I listen? Of course not. Even Peggy Parker Lane warned me of the man. You know, she paid me a personal visit. What that woman doesn't know about people in our town is not worth knowing. She told me she'd seen Arthur kicking an innocent dog so hard with his boots on numerous occasions when a dog was randomly sniffing around his front yard. She said to me, Esther, if a man will do that to a dog, what will he do to you? She even said to me, I think he's a narcissist. You know what they say about narcissists, Esther? Get out of the relationship. Run. Well, say what you like about the garrulous Miss Peggy Parker Lane, I said, but she's absolutely right. As you can imagine, within an hour of my green hermit frog car parked outside our home, word spread like a wildfire that I was back in town. A surprise party was organised for me later that evening. I'm glad to say I saw my best friends Lily and Luke all over again. We reminisced over the Bigfoot we had seen all those years ago. I'll never forget those eyes, said Lily. Oh, they were so kind. Needless to say, after my mother broke things off with Arthur, he began to show his true real colours, treating my mother with contempt and disdain, and spreading nasty rumours about her. Strange little parcels of dog turd were thrown through our letterbox regularly. We knew they were from him. The man had not changed. Needless to say, I managed to go online. I set up a date for my mother with a wonderful man called Huck Hewitt. It was love at first sight between the two of them. They now are very happily married. As for me, I could not return to London after I came back home, as I love my small town so much, because at the end of the day, if the truth be told, there is no place like home. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.